Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on our talk here today on the topic of optimizing language for effective communication of gene therapy concepts with hemophilia patients. I'll be walking through some detail on the qualitative study, and there will be time for questions and comments at the end. Nice to meet you all. My name is Sarah Hendry, and I am a linguist and a researcher with a company called Maslansky and Partners. I have an MBA and focus as well in cognitive science and linguistics in the work that I do here, primarily on medical discourse and understanding how to communicate with physicians, patients, and others in the healthcare space, particularly with the focus on complex and challenging topics like hemophilia and gene therapy. So at Maslansky and Partners and in all of the work that I do, we appreciate that language is very important. And as attendees at a webinar on cognitive and behavioral neuroscience, you all also appreciate and understand how important language and communication is. Our slogan here at the company I work for, it's not what you say, it's what they hear. And I think that applies more broadly than just a corporate tagline. I think it's very important when thinking about communication in general, thinking about how we share things with each other, how we make sure that understanding is reached in between two parties, interlocutors, others, whoever is communicating, or even in print, if there's something printed or education materials. All of these things are really important for us to think about, how that communication is being presented and ultimately what our audiences are hearing. And in healthcare, that is perfectly, perfectly important, particularly important when we think about communicating challenging topics in healthcare. So diving into the topic of the day here, gene therapy in hemophilia, and particularly communicating around the complexities of gene therapy. You all know probably better than I do as folks with PhDs or MDs or other scientific backgrounds here that gene therapy is going to really change the game for a lot of folks with genetic conditions, including hemophilia. We were focused on hemophilia A here. Currently, no gene therapies available. We know there have been some hiccups in the clinical development process for some of these therapies. But regardless, across a variety of other genetic conditions, we have seen gene therapies come out and be hugely life-changing, especially for folks with, with deadly conditions or things, terminal illnesses caused by genetic variants. And these therapies can really change things for those people and their families, as well as the physicians, other healthcare practitioners who are providing care for those individuals. But we also know that gene therapy is very complicated. It's super complex. It's super complex when it comes to how it works, but also, kind of how it's administered and how it's different from standards of care across a variety of different treatment paradigms, particularly in hemophilia, where people are familiar with and used to having to infuse factor VIII, in this case with hemophilia A, on a regular basis, sometimes multiple times a day, depending on the severity of the condition. So thinking about kind of shifting to a single use or a one-time infusion for something like gene therapy, even that is really, game-changing and complicated for a lot of people to understand. So beyond that, when you think about the mechanism of how these things work, not just how you use them, but even in the body, how some of these things are different, thinking about how you could change from taking a treatment multiple times a day potentially to once in a lifetime, really understanding how that's possible is hugely complicated and to be honest, something that took me quite a bit of time to really understand. But I think what we found in this study will be really helpful to demonstrate how language research and specifically kind of looking at communication in these types of situations can foster much better understanding from a cognitive and behavioral standpoint. So as a result, because of the fact that this is so complicated, so complex, as language researchers, we set out to really understand how to talk about gene therapy in a clear and compelling way. And ultimately, how do we provide education materials for these people living with hemophilia in a way that makes sense to them when thinking about the huge complexities behind something like gene therapy? In a very brief format, how can we make this understandable and digestible for individuals across a variety of different education thresholds, different backgrounds, different places that they're coming from. And this is a big challenge, but it's something that I think we've moved forward in a really positive way. How we went about doing this, I won't spend too much time on the methodology, but certainly if there are questions around this, I'd be happy to answer. We conducted a variety of different qualitative methods. So all of this was qualitative research. There was no quantitative validation done in this particular setting here. But we did speak to a large number of people, over 80 individuals across a variety of geographies, both including patients, healthcare providers, nurses, and caregivers, people caring for those living with hemophilia. So we started with a landscape analysis, looking at the language that's being used to describe gene therapy across a variety of sources, primarily branded, different companies that are creating gene therapies or providing similar therapies for individuals. That was a place for us to really expand the horizon and understand what all is being said. What are all of the different inputs that someone might be receiving when they're educating themselves on gene therapy? This was done in English primarily, but you'll see there was some ex-US research and non-English language research done as well. So looking at some of the primary research methods, we used traditional one-on-one IDIs or in-depth interviews over the phone. We also did some group interviewing with individuals, patients, caregivers, and hematologists in the US, UK, Spain, Germany, France, and Italy in native language where not English, so any language in those countries that is the primary one. We also then conducted similar, group research in those countries again after we refined the stimuli based on some conversations with physicians and patient advocates in the advisory board meeting. And then ultimately what you'll see here reflected is, primarily information from the language strategy to build specific lexicon and story flow for this type of conversation. And ultimately, this is the content that went into the Journal of Rare Diseases publication as well. So more specifically, as I mentioned, this was kind of a process of blowing out, exploring, kind of expanding the horizon of different ways of talking about gene therapy. We then focused in on each part of the gene therapy story. So thinking about kind of what is a gene, what is the mechanism of disease, mechanism of treatment. And then ultimately we refined everything. And that's what you'll see reflected here is a conglomeration of all three phases of work to make sure that we're really bringing everything into focus and refining it for a broad audience while understanding the nuances of each audience as well. One of the kind of particularly interesting research methods we used here was something we call emotional response, which is proprietary at Maslansky and Partners, but you may have seen it in the presidential debate testing, for example. It's essentially dial testing, so you're likely familiar with some version of that. So this is a way for us to understand what language is really hitting an emotional chord. It measures what we call System 1 and System 2 thinking, if you've read Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. Really that kind of gut level reaction, as well as then qualitative discussion that helps us really understand the why behind that reaction. So I did not pull in very much from this methodology, but it was a really integral part of how we assessed what was working and what wasn't. So participants reacted to a variety of pieces of language stimuli for us to then see in the moment, what are they reacting to, what's garnering either a positive or negative emotional response. So then ultimately in the follow-up discussions, we can understand that why. We do have a video from some of the follow-up discussion that you'll see coming up here, and that shows you kind of the thinking behind some of the answers that we've provided or the insight that we've provided here. But all of the research is based on a pretty robust and broad kind of variety of methods within qualitative interviewing. All right, now to the fun stuff for the remainder of our conversation. So first of all, this is likely not surprising for you as cognitive and behavioral neuroscientists or others who are interested in the field, but the audience matters. This is kind of, like I said, a base level assumption perhaps, but I think something that's important for us to keep in mind here. People living with hemophilia come to the table with a certain set of priorities, nuances, and what they need to know and what they want to know. And ultimately, emotionally, where they're coming from, living with something like hemophilia that is a genetic condition, happens from birth in most cases. I know it's possible for a mutation to happen over time, but in most cases, this is something you're born with and just have to live with for the rest of your life. And hopefully not everyone in this room at least is familiar with that kind of experience, but it is an important thing for us to keep in mind, knowing that that experience is unique. So a couple of key things about this audience that we learned through the research here that we need to keep in mind, and that I think is important when thinking about any group of people living with a rare disease, especially a genetic condition that they're born with. So first of all, these folks are very highly informed. This was perhaps a little bit surprising to us that across the board, regardless of level of education, these folks were very well educated on their condition. They do a lot of research. They kind of started from a higher level of understanding than perhaps we as researchers expected them to, knowing that it took us a long time to really understand the complexities behind some of these topics. So what that tells us is that we really don't need to fill in every gap for these individuals. They come to the table with a lot of information up front. So we have to keep that in mind, knowing where to start so that we don't talk down to them at any point, but we also don't leave too many gaps for them to fill on their own. They're also coming to the table with an emotional investment. I think some of this as well seems somewhat obvious, but again is really important from a research standpoint for us to keep in mind. These folks are born with hemophilia. So for patients and caregivers, they're living this every day, and it's not something they can turn off or step away from. That comes inherently with a lot of emotion, positive, negative, neutral, just there's a big emotional attachment to it. And for physicians, this is their life's work. For a lot of these hematologists, oncologists that we spoke to, or just hematologists who don't work in oncology, they may not have a lot of hemophilia patients, but they do have a lot of patients with bleeding disorders, and this is something that they think about a lot, especially when looking at younger people who are living with conditions like this that are fairly severe, that may limit or impact the quality of life that they're able to have. So this becomes very personal for physicians, as many of you in the audience likely know. So in this case, it does need to align with our language and how we use language to make sure that we're respecting the emotional impact of something like this, but also using accurate language and not overhyping the emotion on our end either, because there's enough of that already. We don't need to add too much to it. And then finally, again, perhaps obvious, each of these people living with hemophilia are individuals. They are each, they're coming to the table with different things. Even if they all have a similar body of knowledge, their own life experience is going to be different. So when we think about something like gene therapy that has a really specific way of working, we have to keep in mind that there is not one specific benefit that's going to matter to everyone. Here I have a video explanation that kind of brings to life some of that feeling and some of that emotion of that kind of individualistic nature of folks living with hemophilia.
My life might improve drastically soon.
What about your life might improve drastically?
Mainly just not having to worry as much. Not like, oh, I'm going on this trip, I better bring all of this factor with me, and like, oh, gotta infuse, oh, I forgot to infuse, I guess I can't do this activity, or just like being free from that. I would probably go nuts and like do like skydiving and stuff and go crazy.
A lot of people look at people who have bleeding disorders and they don't realise that possibly the worst thing about having a bleeding disorder isn't the pain and the bleeds and things, it's having to stick needles with yourself. That to me has always been the sort of the thing that is the big selling point about gene therapy.
I think it's just being very cognizant, because we are not a one-size-fits-all population.
I think they sum it up there nicely in their own words, so I don't need to say too much more. But thinking about, one-time therapy, that could mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people, right? We saw for one that it could mean that he could go skydiving and feel safe doing that and not worry about a bleed. For another, it just means that he won't have to stick himself with needles all the time, and that's a pretty huge selling point for him. So we came to this thinking that we could kind of land on one emotional benefit as the way to couch all of the language and all of the communication, and found that, as that final individual said, this really is not a one-size-fits-all option. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of communication platform. And while we need to have consistent language, we have to figure out what kind of language we can use to make that benefit feel individual. So that's really the main point here, or the main element that we brought together for the folks we were working with, and for thinking about how to communicate about gene therapy in an effective way, is thinking about how we can individualize that benefit without over-individualizing it. So ultimately, the way we were able to do that is through this language on the slide here. Gene therapy allows the body to produce factor VIII on its own. So there are a couple of really interesting elements driving ultimately this recommendation here. This is very important for us because it showed the therapy is doing something, but the therapy is not doing everything. It's just allowing the person's body to do something that it originally could not do, that someone without hemophilia could do. We're just enabling something. We're not doing it ourselves or doing everything with the therapy. By talking about allowing the body to produce factor VIII, so the body is also an important part of this here. We started by thinking about cells or genes or DNA, or kind of breaking things down to that really base level kind of place. But we heard that that was a little bit too technical, even for this very highly informed audience. So by talking about the body, it brings all of that together in a format that's understandable for a large group of people. This word produce was also very important here. We heard that everyone already knows that not producing factor VIII is the problem. They know that that's what happens in hemophilia. So by talking about production, we were able to kind of distance ourselves from traditional therapies and show how it's different, in that when you're using factor replacement, you're replacing, you're not producing. So here that's automatically differentiating and showing how this is new and different from therapies that existed before. And then finally, on its own, really shows how this is changing the mechanism within the person's body. It's allowing it to do on its own. It doesn't require any outside assistance. It doesn't require any additional augmentation necessarily. So that really kind of cements how this is different from other therapies. So this language in particular was hugely meaningful in how we can communicate the promise of gene therapy. And that's really the crux of what was communicated in the paper as well, is that language like this kind of keeps it open enough for each person to personally interpret what that means for them, but it's specific enough that each person can really understand ultimately the message that's being given. I'll just go very quickly through these next couple of slides here, but first of all, I think it's interesting and really helpful to learn that even as we tested across multiple geographies, a lot of this language worked consistently. You can see here there are really only 4 areas that there's maybe some slight difference or slight nuance across market. For example, we can refer to hemophilia A as a condition in English, but in German and Romance languages, it works better to refer to it as a disease. There are different nuances in how that's kind of felt when you say something like a condition or a disease, how it's processed. So you can see there are a couple of nuances there, but generally speaking, very consistent across a variety of audiences, which was also really interesting for us. And across different stakeholder groups as well, you see we have patient, caregiver, nurse, and HCP, which we're referring to as the MD here. Very, very consistent across the different audiences as well. Just a few nuances you can see in terms of how straightforward language they want or need, slash how much information they need for us to provide upfront versus giving less and allowing them to kind of tease it apart on their own. Interestingly, in terms of the amount of information, the patient and physician are very close on that kind of vertical or the horizontal scale there. And of course, it makes sense that the patient and caregiver would be similar in some ways in terms of how straightforward of language they want. But generally speaking, this is a pretty small axis. So the differences are very small. And ultimately, the language that we recommend here on the next couple slides ultimately kind of work across the board. Some of it may be a little bit more lay for the physician than ultimately would be seen in a scientific publication or journal article. But generally speaking, a lot of it kind of works across the aisle, which also helps to really bring forward better connection or connective tissue between the physician conversation and the patient conversation, which then can happen together in the doctor's office. So you can see here a summary of the language recommended for how to refer to some of these different topics here under what is gene therapy, mechanism of disease, how it works, and ultimately kind of the goal of gene therapy, which we already talked about here. You can see there are a couple of interesting nuances. Ultimately, a lot of the language here is much more plain spoken in the left-hand side on the language to use versus the language to lose over there. A couple of pieces that I'd like to call out before we close. One that I found particularly interesting was that the word mutation was not received negatively, and in fact was received more positively by a patient group than I would have expected. It sounds potentially off-putting, referring to someone as having a mutation. To someone like myself who does not have a genetic condition, it sounds inherently negative. But for them, it sounded both more factual than other terms, and also for some of the patients, it made them feel kind of special. We heard a lot of references to X-Men, at least in the US, when we used the word mutation, so that was kind of interesting as well. And then the other one that I want to point out just very quickly here is this language of functional gene versus healthy gene. I think it's not a big surprise that language like healthy could potentially sound a little bit off-putting if someone is saying, well, then my gene is unhealthy. What does that mean? But functional just very clearly demonstrates that it's working in the way it should, but it's not passing any judgment on, the ways the body are working or the way the body is working on its own to begin with, beyond the production of factories. So that's my presentation here for you. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I wanted to go through quickly, but I believe there will now be time for questions, comments, or feedback, and thank you so much.